You always ask him if he wanted to have tea. Well, good afternoon. My name is Jens Hoffmann, and I'm the curator of Mementos, Artefacts, Souvenirs, and other Curiosities, which you see behind us. And I'm very happy to have Laure Prouvost here with us today to talk a little bit about her contribution to the exhibition. And before we start our dialogue, I just wanted to give you a quick introduction about what the exhibition is about, so you understand the context a little bit better. About, not even that long ago, about 7 months, I was approached by Art Brussels if I wanted to collaborate with the fair and organize an exhibition here in this space, sort of a little bit separate from the actual art fair. And as a curator, I was thinking, what could I do if I curate an exhibition for an art fair? Because usually, as a curator, you're not necessarily in the business of the art market and thinking about buying or selling art. And I was starting to think about questions of value and what type of different forms of value exists. And of course, the art fair is a lot about monetary value. There's an exchange and sort of like a particular type of economy where, you purchase an artwork, whether that's a painting, photograph, or sculpture, and there's an exchange of money, and it also signifies a certain investment. And particularly in the more recent times with like the booms of the auction houses and so on, there's been like an increased commodification of artworks. And I was thinking, like, is there a way to think about value in a different way? Not like this value of finance and economy, but in a different type of value. And one of the things that I was thinking about was personal value, or even more sort of emotional and sentimental value. That was something that I was thinking about, because it's something that maybe one person feels for an object, but for everybody else there's no connection to it. And that has also to do with, what our personal relationships are to objects. So I asked about 70 artists that are participating in the fair to give me an object that they had a personal relationship with, a personal affinity, something that was important to just them. And it's often objects that, as I said, are extremely valuable to the person who owns it, but they might be of absolute no value to someone else. And in some way, I think your contribution has a lot to do with that in terms of the various types of values. So I wanted to, before we start, maybe read you a little text. So what we've done is, or if you want to read it, that's also good. In these little booklets, you find the stories of the artists. We asked the artists to tell us, why is this object important to us? And there is all these contributions here, about 73 contributions of all artists that you are participating here. And for me, it was also about a question of thinking about the ready-made and the 100th anniversary of the ready-made, and like, what is art and how do we define art, and what is the context that creates art? And a lot of questions sort of like come up within this whole exhibition. And so let me just read you Lauren's little text. It says, I have many tea bags like this, but this one is special because of its unusual shape it got when drying. I often dry my tea bags to reuse them for another cup. The object is a wink towards the practice of John Latham, who Laurence was the assistant of, whom I consider my conceptual grandfather. We used to reuse tea bags while working. It also has a connection to One Tea, a piece I made about Kurt Schwitters. Schwitters called his wife One Tea because she constantly asked him, do you want tea? This subject became a large body of work of mine. Making tea is very connected to daily life and very domestic. Art and life don't need to be separate, they can become one. And the last sentence resonated a lot with me, that we often think about the separation between art and life. And I thought this last sentence where you were saying, like, art doesn't need to be separated from life. It doesn't need to be sort of like a precious object. It can be something that's maybe, much more sort of informal and perhaps doesn't have this sort of kind of fetish value, preciousness, yes, was something that I thought was very interesting. So I was just like wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the tea bags and how this all came about. And
yeah, so these few tea bags you've got here are very special because they're the last tea bag my granddad used before his last concept was to dig a tunnel from London to Africa, and that's the last one he used, and they were drying on the heaters. So for me, they're very important. He hasn't been back for now 4 months, and we're slightly worried. So these tea bags are very emotional. They're connected to lost memories, to lost histories. And I'm also showing a few others at Serpentine in London because we're doing a show around John Latham, who I used to assist. And for me, there was a really great remark recently in the Daily Mirror or in London, like, artists use tea bags. What's next? It's sort of this sort of really pissed off idea that anything could be art or any. And for me, this is it. This is art. This is when you connect to something, to an object, when you have a story with it, or you have a total empathy to something. It's a kind of empathy with this bottle, and I think this show is great for that because you start using much more your imagination, and you feel very much the body of the person who decided to show you what is close to or what is being touched by. So these tea bags are very special tea bags because they even have a bit of pink in them. It's like, I don't know, at the end of his life he got really into like herbal stuff. So it's like, so it's even more like magic.
Well, I liked what you said about the comment in the newspaper, whether or not tea bags can actually be art. And I mean, it's like a question, I was living in London for 5 years, and I don't think there's any other place that I've ever worked with or lived at where there's this question in the public coming up so often about the question of, is this art or not? And I think the British newspapers just like the sort of controversy around this. But what I thought is perhaps lacking is a certain sensitivity for things, like to sort of like really look at them and like study them and immerse yourself in them. Because I found with the tea bags, the forms of the tea bags, the colors, the different variations of the colors, they're for me, when I saw them for the first time, they were miniature paintings, basically. That's how I felt about them. And also the process of, they are wet before, then you dry them, and it totally reminded me of like a conceptual process of painting. I don't know if you thought about that at all.
Yeah, well, for me, they always hang around John Latham's studio. For me, they were as important as his painting on the walls. They had the same texture in some way, and the thing they would be much more reused than his work. Usually his work stayed there. But I like the process of, this sort of the limits again between what's considered art, what's considered life. And I think they're very, it's the way you look at anything. That's how we decide what's art or not, I guess. A lot of tea bags get put in the bin and never been looked again, and they're all really sad and crying, and the rubbish bins. These ones are very proud.
Well, I have to say that I find dry tea bags aesthetically much more pleasing than wet ones. So I'm glad you dried them.
Well, it's better to reuse them.
I don't know if you had the chance to actually see how we displayed them, but to me, when I saw them, it was very clear that I wanted to have a lot of space around them. That they really have like room to breathe, because that really gives you the chance to go more into them and look at them more and more carefully. And perhaps it's too precious. I can't really say.
No, like I'm sure Granddad would have liked that. It's like, important tea bags. I think it's in the Serpent I show them on the heaters, and I put heaters in the gallery, and like people didn't even think that the heaters would have been placed there. Like, why do we put tea bag on the heater? And this idea of, am I in someone's home, or I am in a gallery space? And having this question between your expectation of being in a gallery or in someone's home, or how you look at things. I think that's when it gets interesting.
Well, another thing that I thought about, because I knew about the show at the Serpentine, and the Serpentine is this little garden pavilion in Regent's Park, and obviously it's very, very British, very English, and one of the things that English people like to do is having their afternoon tea. So I was thinking like how much that is also has a relationship to the place that you spend a lot of time in London, and this ritual of drinking tea that's very British, and maybe also making a comment on these kind of traditions that exist.
Yeah, for sure. I think this comes from a body of work I talked about around Wanty, which I was asked by Tate to do a piece around Kirchwit in the Lake District. And I found out that he called his wife Wanty because she kept asking him, do you want some tea? And sort of quite patronizing, but also humorous, and his work has a lot of humor. So then I knew that Tate only asked me to do something because my granddad was a close friend of Kirchwit. They didn't think I was a very good artist, but they were like, okay, try something. But, so I did a whole documentary in the living room of my granddad, who from where he was taking his tunnel to go to Africa. So it's a lot, but the video is much more about my grandma, who's totally, who loves Wanty, and it's all about tea parties. We're constantly having teas, and she makes these wonderful teapots, which have a lot of bums in it because my granddad likes bums. So it's all like trying to please everyone, and so that's the culture of tea was also. And I knew what I had to do to win the Turner Prize, just make a tea piece, I need to do something about beers here, or fries. But it was very much. But I'm so part of it, it was really part of my life. And we have tea all the time, and with John Latham, it was, every 30 minutes you have a cup of tea, and you just work around the clock like this, and you reuse. At first, I was not so keen of reusing tea bags, but I got used to it, But you also leave the wall. So these tea bags are not just about my personal memory. I think it's deeper. It's like, what is the idea of a tea bag? When did it come along that we cut this paper, stick a bit of tea in it? Where in the past you would have big pack of teas, and you would this idea also how we throw away everything. And, I think it has a much deeper historical depth in some ways. The colonization of India, with it's so layered in some way when you look at a tea bag now, and this idea of constant quantities of packaging that's being thrown away, and he during the war was for sure pretty precious, I think, or so I guess there's this side which is slightly more political in some ways, but it's very deep.
That's interesting that you said that. My grandmother, she used to tell me the stories that she had to use the tea bags again and again because they couldn't really get new tea.
Where was that?
That's when they were leaving. My grandparents, they were from Czechoslovakia, and they had to leave during the Second World War. And when they were on the road to escape, they were doing the use of the tea bag, and so it had a particular meaning for her. Yeah. But she continued to do this throughout her life, and I was always like, "Ooh, that's so strange." But for her, it was very normal, and. Yeah. So that reuse of tea bags seems to be part also of a certain generation, because I think she's probably the same age as John Latham, and they went through a similar sort of history with the Second World War.
Yeah, when there's less of something, you care for it a lot more, I guess, and it's also quite beautiful to care a bit more.
Tell me a little bit more about like this last sentence of your text about the separation of art and life, and not separating it, because I think there's many different ways of how you can think about the separation and the non-separation, like whether you engaged directly in the public sphere and making work that like engages people outside of a museum, or you use everyday objects like you do in many ways to make that connection.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I'm more and more interested every day with my practice. I'd like to Where was it? But I'd like to have I did a piece in MMK in Frankfurt where it was I remade a sort of provincial travel agency, and you go in, you see there's all the posters, and when visitors come, like, what am I doing with the high heels? Like, what's this? And then there's a guard who tells you it was called deep travel, so you go deeply in the body of the earth or the work, but it was still very, very. And I really like this fact. Oh, am I looking at art or not? And then you have mirrors and you discover things were hidden in the space. And a few people would come. Oh, do you mind checking quickly? How much would it cost to go to I don't know, somewhere to Java, to Italy and then you went to another big space where it was much more my videos, which were really. It's the way you expect an exhibition could be, but also very physical. Where I wanted you in dark, it was really red, and you were inside the belly or something. So, I think of course art is always about representation, and sometimes I like that I've got anything I can to play with. How do I create anxiety? How do I translate or an emotion, and sometimes it's purely just sound and image, but sometimes I also I think it's also interesting to start question where the expectation is. Mostly the expectation, and I don't think we need to go directly on the street, or it's actually maybe more the institution that we can question, or we can play a bit more with this idea of display or the idea of presenting things, and I think the audience have to. It's more fun when you have to work a bit around it or find your way.
Well, the institution provides you a framework that is a context for a sort of discourse around these questions, whereas in the public sphere, that context is often missing, or you have to artificially create it in order to make clear what it is. You can be a bit
too direct. So I think it's possible in both spheres. I've played with posters quite a bit on the streets.
Yeah.
But I think, both. I think it's good that it escapes sometimes, but I love the institution to play with it.
I came here on Monday to install the works, and we all laid them out, and they were all over the place, and then we tried to do little groups, connections between different pieces, telling little stories about them, and then I was rereading the booklet and going, looking, what did Mathieu Mercier write about his little pencil, and what did Harold Enkert write about this, trying to sort of go through it. And I noticed that there's a lot of fact and a lot of fiction in many of the stories. I won't tell you which ones, but once you start reading the little stories, it often comes up where you think oh, did you really kill a shark? I'm not sure, but that's what I also liked a lot about the show, that there is a sort of ambivalence. You never really know whether some of the stories are actually true or not. And my question in that regard was, what do you think is actually the show? Is it the stories, or is it the objects? Because if you see an object just like this, what does it tell you about the person, if you don't know the work of the person, or you just see oh, this is a pencil sharpener. Okay.
I think it's both, but it's I don't know. I think it'd be nice to open up to, but I think that I'm very connected to stories. My work is very connected to stories and to words and to narrative and this question of fiction and reality, and I really love when it's not explicit and it's not clear, and having any way everything. It makes life much more fun and interesting. If you sort of try to give fact to everything and have a bit more fantasy and imagination, so in some way you can create your own narrative, I guess, when you look at this show. But it's also, I think it's also nice to read the text, because you start to have someone else's point of view. So it's always I mean, each work exists through the viewer, the person who looks. So I love that fact that an artist totally loses control, and I really like the idea that a work in 200 years, these tea bags would be, I'm not sure what, where would they be,
Have to talk to conservator about
exactly.
that. Yeah.
But how things change constantly with history or with a situation and or with a person. If when I do a show in China, it's so different, the understanding of the work, especially just with language. I use English a lot, and but it's interesting. I mean, it opens it more. It's magic. It's like I'm just proposing one thing. It's so nice to know that the work exists in so many ways. And here it can exist through the text, but also very much whatever people make of it, I guess.
Yeah,
and you connect very much, like you say, your grandma. We all have grandparents alive or dead or whatever, and we can all connect. Oh, I had a teddy bear like that, but it didn't have a willy, or, but you start to think of your own. It's very nice to have also that.
Yeah, and it speaks a lot also about the relationship we have to objects, how maybe humans find create identity through objects, things that they collect, that they keep, that they want, that they put around us. I have that very, very much so, because I've been sort of uprooted and lived in many places, and my connection, or what I would call home, which is sort of like the basis of how you develop your identity, are really objects, many different things, you know.
It's where it's our second skin, and it's this thing that there's only own connection, but then there's a lot. But I think I also like the way you decided to display them. It's quite with the little box, quite museum. It's like they're as important as a piece that you will find. I don't know. It's this sort of giving importance to something that is very just emotional or very.
Yeah, we were thinking about cabinet of curiosities, where you find many different things and can somehow explore this, and have like many things that are not necessarily artworks, but like objects from natural, that are more coming from nature, or those sort of antiquities and things like this. But I just thought maybe we open it up to the public and see if there's any questions from the public.
Or if you want a cup of tea, we can.
We can also have a cup of tea in the bag and then start to collectively dry the tea bags afterwards.
Keep them safe.
So
not lose our history. Or history, I quite like. His story.
His story.
Yeah.
So any questions? Yeah. Wait, we have one microphone, and if we can probably just share this one if we want to.
It's maybe a very trivial question, but I saw the show yesterday. And I saw your tea bags, and I was wondering, it looked a bit disgusting in a way, like to use it and try it. And, does it, I have no idea, what's the idea? You keep reusing them, or is it more the ritual, or the memory, or?
It's very practical at first. It's like, I think it's just to not use too many and to do about 4 cups with one tea bag. And they're very connected to my grandfather. I don't tend to do it that much, but you can dry them and they still taste pretty good the second time. It's.
And you throw it away after 5.
Well, apart from this time where they become very precious, but there's a point where they start to not taste very much.
Yeah, exactly.
but it's. You still can use them a few times. So the future is in drying our tea bags and save the planet. Come on.
Maybe just wanted to add something about that in terms of like what Laurent was saying in terms of the history of tea and how tea arrived in England and how there is this particular ritual in England that you have to drink tea. And I think it's very multi-layered in a way. And then you end up actually drying these tea bags, and then these tea bags become these sort of like beautiful objects that have particular colors, particular forms. But you as an artist are not in control of how they are actually coming out, because of wrinkles on them and the fruits or the tea leaves that are inside, they create a different type of color. So it's sort of like an artwork or an object that you as an artist can't really control, that creates itself just through this process of like brewing it and drying it. And I like that sort of idea that you're not in full control and it's a work in progress. And, there's also this other aspect that you actually work of life, because you drank the tea before, like the essence, the thing that you usually throw away all of a sudden becomes the more important thing, and so it speaks also about ecology, I think.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. I love the camera too.
I know, they're very good. Yeah. Any other questions? There's the microphone.
Yeah.
Do you have a preference for a different kind of brand? Do you prefer like Tesco own brand or Tetley or
no frills?
No frills,
Yeah.
cheap as possible. And the other question I wanted to ask is there a Belgian equivalent or like maybe a French equivalent to the tea?
The French are much more snobby about their tea. Like never put a bit of milk in it, which. And it's more, it's sort of more precious and less common, and so there's less quantity of teas as well being sold in France. And here, I don't know. I think here I get my Earl Grey from Twinings. No, I think you just go for a beer in Belgium. Huh? You just pass the tea.
I just wanted to say, like for me, it becomes less about the experience of drinking tea and tea-related things, but more about when you see something in an artwork and, I've seen your tea bags in various contexts, and it becomes less about the tea and more about how it seeps into your consciousness. And every time I see it, it's now your work in the living room or wherever. And so it's kind of like the art is, it seeps, and it's great.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yes, it is wonderful.
Great. You can own the Laure Prouvost piece.
Hello.
Keep it safe. I'll
I
sign
want
it.
to ask Jens, you mentioned at the start about being interested around the idea of commodification, not commodification, and objects and artists that you're working with. But these are also, pretty interesting artists that are familiar in some ways, even in their own uniqueness, and by their nature, there becomes a different sort of interest or value, for lack of a better word, in these objects that may be shifted if this were everybody on the first floor of an apartment building or something like this. And there's an entire market out there that's based on ephemera and layers of relationship and time and place that bring all kinds of value to these objects. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your selection and what you were thinking about in the people you invited, or just something about this.
Well, when I was invited, the fair said, I was first asking them, can I invite anybody that I want? And they said, well, it would be good if you would invite artists that are also participating in the fair, because if someone sees an artwork in the fair and you have a solo booth there, and then you come and see the work like an object of them, maybe there's a certain way of making a relationship. Like this morning we had a talk with Chris Martin, and he has his little bell there where the hammer of the bell is missing and it doesn't ring anymore. And he got that like many, many years ago, but then 10 years later, he decided to make a really big one. So there's this relationship that this object inspired this artist to make another thing that then, became more visible in his artwork. And so we actually pretty much reached out to all of the artists that I knew, whose work I liked, who I felt like maybe there could be something interesting in terms of an object, and trying to also make a mix of various people of different generations. And one of the things that, and Paul, he was working with me on coordinating the exhibition. At the beginning I said to him, oh man, do you really think anybody's going to give us anything? Maybe they all think this is such a strange thing. And we were thinking, oh, maybe it's going to be like 20 artists or 25. And then all of a sudden it's like 80 artists. And it became much bigger than we anticipated. So there was like this thing of the artists responding very, very enthusiastically about it. I was not expecting that. I wasn't like, oh, is Larry Clark really going to even write me back, or Jenny Holzer, or like, you know, these sort of like super famous artists who probably have no time in the world to do anything other than like being busy with their exhibitions. But they wrote back with long emails explaining why, and they were very interested in that. And I really loved that people would sort of make the time in these busy schedules to do that. And I think it sort of touched a nerve. You know, and there were even artists who heard about this. Can I be part of this too? Because I have this other thing that I think would fit really, really well. And, you know, so then we collected all these things. And honestly, we included, I think, only 2 things that were proposed that we didn't include. One artist wanted to put an artwork of himself into the show, which, you know, I thought, well, you know, this belongs over there. And then the other one wanted to include, which is almost an artwork, something that he made with his son that was also kind of an artwork. And I felt like this is really not about, like, you know, extending the sort of presentation of the fair where you have the artworks, but really looking at, like, you know, personal items and personal objects.
Yeah, I just was wondering that that this exhibition proves also that before an artist becomes an artist, he's first like a collector also. And that I was wondering if you didn't brought or didn't give the tea bags, what else was in your possible collection of non-art objects to give? And then also, if you talked about this last sentence about the separation, the non-separation between art and life, this comes close to maybe everybody of us, because I think that maybe partly all of us, especially when we were a child, we were keeping shells and toys and puppets and things, so that we are all like, you know, gathering things, like it goes to prehistory and so on. So this aspect is quite interesting.
Yeah, we
also
collected berries, and I love Peter Kubelka when he talks a lot about. Have you seen him talk or not? Peter Kubelka. I think we collect objects, but also emotions. I think for me, it's maybe more emotion of things that I felt, or anxiety, or happiness that I want to retranslate, or try to find a way, either with a video, with an object, or whatever fit best in some ways. And he talks a lot about how with our mothers we might have all gone and tried to pick raspberries or blueberries, and then she tells you that you try a green one and it's sour, it's not good, and they say get the dark one, and then how we compare everything we leave. If you have an amazing raspberries, I think every other raspberry you'll ever have, you'll compare it unconsciously to that best one. Or so this emotion that you compare and they collect, and the same with collecting objects, what emotion you have with it, and that's when it becomes very dear to you. And how do you translate that with an audience or with someone? And we all do it, and we're all artists in that. In a way, we might care for something, or we might. I don't know. I think it's a very large subject, and it's very tricky to talk about. But I think this idea of emotion that we can, and the idea of comparison in emotion, in moments, is I find it fascinating, and that's something that happened. We did it when we in a prehistoric time already, and it's still something that we're busy with, and deciding when it has importance. I guess I don't know. I don't know if I'm answering the question. But yeah.
I just wanted to add something to that. Something that I really haven't spoken about, and I wanted to just see what you think about that, was also that how our society manifests itself through these type of objects. Not only the objects that we identify with ourselves, but the whole idea of civilization, sort of like based on the transformation of materials from one state to the other. So there's wood, and there is graphite, and then we put it together, and we make a pencil. And there's leaves, and we put them in a bag, and then we brew them, and then they become tea. But it's always about this sort of like transformation of material, and we add more and more and more to it. And when I look at like the two sort of like political systems, whether that is communism or socialism or just talking about the two prevalent sort of ideologies of the 20th century, in both cases, it's really about this transformation of material. And I really like this idea of emotions that are ephemeral and not material, that are circling around an object. So that's why I was asking before, is the object more important, or the emotion and our sort of sensation that we have with that?
Yeah, I would like to ask you something about the work, your work actually. You spoke before about the stories. So as a storyteller, as you are, what is the relationship with the space? Because what really fascinates me always with your work is this kind of cocoon that's everywhere. It's like a cocoon that holds the work. How necessary is that for the work if we separate the object from the space that actually you're creating? And why it's necessary that for you?
Yeah, I don't know. I never thought of it, but you're right. I think I create definitely. I don't know. I think it's like maybe sort of wanting to be inside and sharing things that are maybe hard to share normally, or we keep it inside us. And I find, even in the fair here, I'm always like, I'm showing object on the wall. It's like, what am I doing? How? And I'm like, I like to create a situation where the viewer becomes a character. You become part of the work, usually in the piece I make. So I think it's, so we share something. That's, unless I'm the artwork, you're the viewer. And I really, if I can, is break this. I really love that aspect, and in some way that's how it creates this sort of global belonging of sort of. But it's also a trick. It's also just way I manage to play with a space, but it's still a concentration of emotion and ideas and the way we are with wood or with carpet, or how do we feel in it. The carpet is straight away you feel a bit in a living room at home, or so it has all this connotation that you start using. And here it's like with the little booth, there's a man cleaning the floor who's a bit pissed off of having to clean everybody's mess, and there's always more people coming in the fair, and it's so annoying. And it talks about how the art world are annoyed to be stuck there and they can't move, and they wish they would be. And so it was very much about a kind of frustration of being there, but also trying to please. Like, look, I look great, and so a bit of humor with the idea of work, the object being presented and having to impress or being touch someone or trying to. So it was very, this was more playing on this idea of display almost, and so it's a bit less cocoon.
That's quite the quality of the work, of course, because what you really see on the fair, what sticks out is exactly that. You don't succeed to create an object in the end, I have to tell you.
Really?
Probably you're really very disappointed with the galleries, but I think that's also something. And site-specificness, how much it's important for the work?
Yeah, I can't help it but not be conscious of where the work belongs. Now I'm working in a piece for Salt in Istanbul, and it's such a tricky situation. So it's a lot of cleaning men trying to clean the dust of the past or the future, trying to make it as smooth and as pleasant as possible, or how. So it's sometimes just about situation, or Yeah, it depends. Some works come from mistranslated books, but I would have a much more fictional side to it. But often it's, I don't know, if you're in a room like this, you can't ignore it, you know, same for you when you notice that we all have to, you have to engage with your audience. The audience may be the big building. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe one more question coming back to certain curatorial decisions, because when you said that you obviously wanted to think about it, about a certain cabinet of curiosities, on the other hand, we have this podium here, and suddenly it's becoming a stage with a certain stage design or with a certain variety of silent actors. So how were you actually thinking about this particular setup?
Yeah, the vitrines very much sort of like came from thinking about this cabinet of curiosities, but then we were thinking about this talks program, and we felt like rather than going into a separate room or having a sort of very tiny confined space, you know, that we could build here, we just open it up and the audience sees us talking, but we actually have the exhibition right in the background, or we basically are sitting in the... Yeah. So it's sort of like the whole thing becomes basically enclose an entire thing that is like one unit. So there's not actually necessarily a separation between what we are doing here right now, this, and the questions and the dialogue that we're having with the audience. So it's sort of like a theatrical type of setting and a dramaturgical kind of device that is employed. Well, good. Okay. Thank you very much. And we have another talk today at 5:30. Yes. So I hope you guys can all come back at 5:30 for our final talk. There's going to be more talks over the next couple of days. It's quite a big, full schedule of readings. And we also invited an anthropologist and a psychoanalyst to come and talk with some of the artists to sort of like go more in depth about what these objects might reveal about the world around us, but also very, very specifically about the artists themselves. So have a look at the schedule and come back if you're still around. Thank you.